This is Tom Fox. Welcome to the newest edition in the Compliance Podcast Network, my latest podcast, Compliance and Coronavirus. As the voice of compliance, I wanted to start a podcast which will help bring both clarity and sanity to the field of compliance, the compliance practitioner, and indeed the compliance profession during this worldwide health and healthcare crisis. Taking up a variety of topics as diverse as working from home to sporting events, to the role of the board of directors, to crisis management, to the role of supply chains. We will look at all of these in this podcast. If you have a topic you'd like covered on compliance and coronavirus, please let me know. I'd be happy to do a podcast on it. Today's podcast concludes our week of affiliated monitors on compliance and coronavirus. Today I have with me Mikhail Reider-Gordon. We take a look at the issues relating to business reopenings, in some cases business closings, all from the compliance perspective. It's a fascinating exploration of where we are now and where we may be down the road. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode. And today I have back with me Mikhail Reider-Gordon. And she is a managing director at Affiliated Monitors. And first of all, thanks so much for taking the time to visit with me.
It is my pleasure to be back with you, Tom.
Today I wanted to take up some of the topics, issues that you were seeing around COVID-19. So I was wondering if I could start with, what are perhaps the three top questions you are seeing around phased business reopening, recognizing that you're in California, I'm in Texas, states are in various phases of reopening or reclosing. Or something or other. And so I was just wondering, what are some of the top issues you're seeing around that issue from the compliance perspective?
Yeah, I think, the top question, how did you manage the disruption since we started the reopening process and now we're shutting down again and we're looking at the fall with additional shutdowns or continued shutdown? Flexibility, right? I mean, it may sound trite, but flexibility. Leverage the fact that by now your staff have figured out largely how to work with one another remotely. If they were going to be able to do that, they've got it down by now. That said, don't chintz. Don't be cheap on that robust communication platform. This is not the time to rely solely on freebies, and this is not to ding the Zooms and the free conference calling apps of the world, but invest in secure encrypted communications. I think the next question is, it's all so uneven. We've got our organization has, locations scattered all around the country, the world. Do we have to change our processes? And I say, no, adapt. Are you ever going to get back to normal? Look, if I had those kind of prognostication capabilities, I'd probably play the ponies and run a very successful hedge fund. I bridle at the excuse that these are uncertain times. Life is uncertain. It's the nature of life. It's the nature of business, right? We fool ourselves when we make any assertions to the contrary. Unanticipated, unforeseen events happen all the time to businesses. Organizations experience disruptive events. They did so before the pandemic. They'll do so again after the pandemic, long after a vaccine is developed, I hope. There will be other disruptions. And in some ways, this is the test of the risk plan, right? What did you anticipate was capable of genuinely disrupting your business? Have you made adjustments? It's not applicable. There's not a panacea for one and all. I do think on the compliance front, it worries me a little bit when I look at currently so many American folks who won't comply with the most basic COVID-19 safety precautions, right? We're seeing a lot of pushback on wearing masks in public. Some businesses opting not to even require that. And the activities we've seen in bars and parties, it doesn't really bode well for the notion, right, of us having an inbuilt ethical culture of compliance as a nation. If we can't comply with the regulation and guidance, for saving our own lives and others, friends and family, What does that mean for fostering a culture of compliance in a business organization or institution? I think another thing that firms need to think about are the implications of their wider compliance function. Have you stopped or reduced your oversight of certain areas being managed? Are you still meeting your reporting deadlines for regulatory reporting? Can you make those operational changes now? Again, we've had quite a number of months now to adjust. So this is also the time, I think, to step back and take a look at have you dropped the ball in some areas just because of the disruption?
So let me pick up on the last point, Kyle, because you seem to move past the issue of a culture of override to really a culture of noncompliance, and that you fear that could creep into not only an organization but really the philosophy of a compliance function just to get through this phase of wherever we are in the COVID-19 saga, and that's something that you believe compliance officers need to absolutely face down.
Oh, absolutely. And I think if they need that external validation that these are genuine concerns, that this sort of this attitude adjustment, not for the better, I think you have to look at regulatory guidance that has come out over the past few months from a myriad of regulatory bodies. Don't make this assumption that they're going to refrain or decrease their surveillance of corporate behavior. It's very clear, not just here in the U.S. but elsewhere in the world, that whilst regulators are sympathetic to what businesses are faced with at the moment and what the pandemic has created, but compliance remains critical here, and for compliance officers, I think you can point to this when you're talking to your boards, to other senior leaders. It was only, 4 or 5 weeks ago, David Fuhr, the assistant chief of DOJ's anti-foreign bribery unit, told the Wall Street Journal in an interview that, quote, compliance has to continue, and, quote, reporting and detecting misconduct continue to be very important things for companies to do. And that's absolutely true. If you go back a little further, FATF issued specific guidance to financial institutions on compliance during COVID, and they highlighted key risks associated with money flows during this time. They made a point in the guidance to instruct FIs to tune their compliance programs to better help detect money laundering and threat finance facilitated by the crisis. OFAC, back in April, released a statement saying it recognizes, this can cause, this being COVID-19, it caused technical resource challenges for organizations, but they went on to admonish, look, companies, you've got to take that risk-based approach to sanctions compliance. If you're facing technical or resource challenges caused by the pandemic, and as part of its risk-based approach to sanctions compliance, there's a challenge, and you've temporarily reallocated what resources you would typically use for sanctions compliance towards something else. OFAC will evaluate that as a factor in determining the appropriate administrative response to an apparent violation, but it's only a factor that they'll consider. It's not an excuse. You don't get to say, well, sorry, we redirected everything to COVID and gave up trying to meet our regulatory obligations. FinCEN said something very similar in their guidance, telling FIs, look, consider, evaluate, and responsibly implement innovative approaches, their words, innovative approaches, to meet the compliance obligations, further strengthen financial systems against illicit activity, financial activity. In May, we heard DOJ, SEC, and FBI in a town hall. Don't worry, folks, it was virtual. And every single one of the representatives there really emphasized the criticality of compliance, despite the pandemic. And again, one of them made a point of saying, the impact of the pandemic on operations will not be a defense to a violation. And I think organizations really need to internalize that. The SFO has gone on record saying they're hiring additional staff to address this and the complexity of cases despite COVID. I think this is a wake-up call. This is not the time to cut back on compliance, on due diligence efforts, claiming COVID challenges. And this will go to this goes to Wirecard. But last week, the German government conducted a survey of German companies seeking information about how these companies go about conducting due diligence on their business partners, their suppliers, their vendors, etc., and what level of due diligence they were conducting. And they wanted to get some granularity, some understanding, because they're drafting some legislation at the moment that's relevant. And out of more than 2,000 companies, about 2,200 companies, only 455 were deemed to have provided valid answers back to the German government on their due diligence practices. And of that 450 plus, only half of those actually met basic due diligence standards. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's worrying, and it's extraordinary.
Wow. What a statistic. One of the observations I seem to have made is that COVID-19, I don't think fundamentally changed anything, but what I see is an acceleration of trends that were sort of percolating along. And one of those I wanted to ask you about was in the area of risk assessments. So traditionally, risk assessments might be done annually, some companies perhaps biennially. And now we see risks changing much faster. And even during the time of COVID-19, risks have changed, which have led, I think, people to see the need for not only a more robust risk assessment protocol, but doing it more often. Would you find that to be a fair assessment? And could we incorporate that into compliance going forward?
Yeah, what I'm going to try to do is make an analogy here between public health officers and practitioners who are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and overlay that with the approach of compliance officers, right? So it's CDC and WHO and other scientists and such who track new pathogens, right, that pose a threat to human health. It could be Ebola, MERS, SARS, those yet unknown. But there are clear parallels to the approach that these public health authorities take with respect to disease surveillance and compliance efforts in general. If you think about the three lines of defense, right, they take a global effort. One, they take a global effort to identify, track hundreds of thousands of as yet unseen pathogens that could jump to humans. Two, they monitor blood samples from around the world where the diseases are likely to emerge. And then three, they have a concerted program that maybe collects this information and endeavors to use it ahead of the emerging disease. Well, that's not unlike a risk approach organizations can really already have in place and can adapt, right? Identify potential risks up front and track them, particularly those that carry the highest risks, including business partners, contractors, parties who may develop into, call it, an infection point to the organization. It could be bribery, fraud, collusion, whatever. Two, keep continuously monitoring, right, and testing that compliance throughout the organization's system. This helps you swiftly identify where the problem is emerging. And three, use that information that you gather across the organization, from testing, from risk profiling, and developing and evolving controls and mechanisms to combat fraud, or what we might think of as corporate infection. Don't make these compliance changes predicated on a decrease in your revenue or some other unforeseen disruption alone. If you're going to make those changes to the program, do so only after you've really given it considered thought and identified those new risks and challenges. How are you going to implement the controls against those? Can they really genuinely be accomplished? If they're impractical or impossible, what's the point, right? But don't limit thinking just because you need a workaround. Evolve that. Think of the compliance officer who's sitting at their dining room table, or field staff locked down in their respective countries, still trying to conduct due diligence. I was talking to someone who was serving as a compliance officer to a mid-sized company, and they're doing some fairly high-risk work in Africa. They mentioned due diligence via subscription service, and they didn't seem to have a lot of confidence in signing off on a particular business partner that was new to the company. And they said, well, yeah, there was a current business registration available. But I said, did you follow up? What did you do to confirm all of this? Did you Google Map? Does the business location still actually exist? Are we looking at an empty field? Like, what are you doing? And they said, oh, well, our resources have been cut. I think, well, that's really, you've got to come up with a more workable solution than that. It's not enough. Maintaining, due diligence, ongoing contracts, third parties, not a one-task onboarding risk. It's a horrifying statistic from that the IBA conducted years ago from a survey. It's a few years old now, but they found that 80% of respondents, and they were largely legal counsel, dealing with external legal counsel as an intermediary for an entity or a third party, they relied on a recommendation from a colleague as their form of due diligence. Only 32% still researched the prospective lawyer, but they did so by Googling them. The remote doesn't have to be an obstacle to maintaining compliance or assessing risks. In some ways, it may give you a new perspective.
The changes that we've seen in the practice of compliance, and you detailed several of them in your last answer, do you think that we will maintain those, certainly for the next year or so, but perhaps beyond? Can we incorporate virtual meetings? Can we incorporate more robust due diligence based on documents? Or do we need to go back to the in-person, face-to-face for a large majority of the compliance work we do, Mikhail?
I think there's a lot we can do from the remote. Unfortunately, it ultimately at the end of the day, it is very difficult. We are a social creature, humans, and sometimes there's just no substitution from being on the ground. That said, that doesn't mean you can't leverage resources that are more close to the ground than, say, you are. If you're in the U.S. and you need specific information about a company or new partner in Bangladesh or Africa, or some Ghana. That's not to say that you can't leverage resources there in those countries to assist you. They may be under lockdown, but that doesn't mean that they can't do some things out in the field. And putting in place much more detailed desk-bound documentation collection and verification processes is also not only something that can be done now, but should always be done.
Well, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time, but as we move into new and different phases of COVID-19 and certainly the economic climate, I hope perhaps I can engage you again to see where we might be down the road.
Absolutely. Be my pleasure.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance and Coronavirus. This is the only B2B podcast which brings clear and sane information for both the compliance professional and the business executive. If I could ask you to do one thing, if you could tell one person about this podcast, I'm trying to get the word out about this most unique podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network. So if you could tell one person about it, send them a copy, send them a link, do something to help me publicize this podcast, I would greatly appreciate it. Compliance and Coronavirus is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network, and it appears Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of each week. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for another episode.